Now we will talk about sulci and gyri on the medial surface of the brain. So this is the medial surface of the brain here. We have a very important structure on the medial surface of the brain, which is part from a commissural fiber, the biggest or the largest commissural fiber of the brain, which is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum begins here as a rostrum, and then genu and body, and lastly the splenium of the corpus callosum of the brain. So this part is the genu of the corpus callosum. This is the genu of the corpus callosum, and here we have this is the rostrum of the corpus callosum, and this is the genu of the corpus callosum, and this area here is called the body of the corpus callosum, and lastly the splenium of the corpus callosum, which is this part of the corpus callosum. Just above the corpus callosum we have a very important sulcus, which is the callosal sulcus. So the callosal sulcus extending around the whole corpus callosum, like this black sulcus here is called the callosal sulcus. This is the first one, callosal sulcus. Here we have the anterior cerebral artery is running in this sulcus, the callosal sulcus. Just above this sulcus we have another sulcus. It begins in the anterior and curves above the callosal sulcus until it reaches to the splenium. So it doesn't continue to the whole medial side of the brain. It ends just above the splenium and curves upward like this. So this sulcus here is called Cingulate sulcus. Cingulate sulcus or sulcus cingulate. Okay. What about this sulcus here, which extend on the whole lateral surface of the brain, but actually it begins on the medial side of the brain? This sulcus is the central sulcus. So the beginning of the central sulcus is on the medial side of the brain, and it curves on the lateral surface of the brain as the whole lateral sulcus, which extending on the lateral surface. Okay. Here we have something called ascending part or ascending limb of the sulcus cinguli. So this sulcus here is part from the sulcus cinguli. This is ascending limb of sulcus cinguli. So this is the terminal part of sulcus cinguli here, and this is the ascending part of the sulcus cinguli. Okay, here we have the parieto-occipital fissure. The parieto-occipital fissure, which is lying on the lateral surface of the brain, separating between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. Actually, it begins or it extends on the medial side of the brain as a deep fissure in the medial side of the brain. Begins from from here as the stem of the parieto-occipital fissure, just below the splenium of the corpus callosum, and extend on the medial side of the brain, separating between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe on the medial side. This is the parieto-occipital. Another one, which is a very important sulcus here, which is called calcarine. This is a calcarine sulcus. The calcarine sulcus extending also from below, just below the splenium of the corpus callosum, and on the whole medial occipital surface of the brain. Okay, so we have this is a calcarine sulcus and parieto-occipital, and this part here is the posterior upturnal part, or the terminal part of the sulcus cinguli, and this is the central sulcus here, and this one here is the ascending limb of the sulcus cinguli, and we have in the middle here the central sulcus. Okay. Another structure we should identify on the medial side of the brain is called the fornix. This is part here is called the fornix. It's part of the limbic system of the brain and also part of the commissural fibers of the brain. This fornix is lying just below the corpus callosum, and we have a septum extending between the fornix and the corpus callosum. This septum here is called septum lucidum. So this is the fornix, and this is the septum lucidum. Septum lucidum is the septum which closes the lateral ventricle. So if we remove this septum here, we will see the cavity of the lateral ventricle inside the brain extending into the frontal, parietal, and backward here to the temporal lobe of the brain. So this is the fornix. This structure here is called the fornix, and this is the corpus callosum, and the septum, which is the red septum between them, is called the septum lucidum, which closes the cavity of the lateral ventricle. Just below the fornix, we find another very important structure here, which is called the thalamus. The thalamus is the secretary of the brain, or the largest sensory relay station of the brain. It's part of the diencephalon of the brain. It's the largest part of the diencephalon of the brain, and it forms the lateral wall of the third ventricle and part of the floor of the lateral ventricle of the brain, as we will discuss later. So this is the thalamus. So what are the sulci, what are the gyri which are situated on the medial side of the brain? Important sulci situated on the medial side of the brain. We will begin them from backward forward. So this number one here is called lingual gyrus. So the lingual gyrus is just situated below this sulcus here, which is called the Calcarine Sulcus. So below the Calcarine Sulcus lying the lingual gyrus. This is the lingual gyrus. And between the Calcarine and the Parieto-Occipital fissure, we have this area here, which is the cuneus. The cuneus is lying on the medial side of the brain, and also the lingual gyrus is lying on the medial side of the brain. They both are sharing in the visual area, or the perception of vision. As we will see, the primary visual area is just around the Calcarine fissure. This is area 17 and 18, and the cuneus and the lingual gyrus are sharing in the visual association area, which have the function of interpretation of visual stimuli, or knowing the meaning of this area knows the meaning of the visual stimuli, which is perceived by the visual primary area. This is the cuneus between the calcarine and the parieto-occipital, and the area just in front of the cuneus is the precuneus. The precuneus is lying between the parieto-occipital fissure and the terminal part of the sulcus cinguli. So this is the precuneus. This area here is the precuneus area of the brain. We have a very important gyrus or lobule around the central sulcus, or around the beginning of the central sulcus. This gyrus is called paracentral lobule. This is the paracentral lobule, and it's very important because this area here extend around the central sulcus, is part from both motor and sensory area, which extending on the lateral surface of the brain. As we discussed before, the precentral gyrus in front of the central sulcus on the lateral surface of the brain is extending on the medial side of the brain, and this area here is the area of lower limb motor area, and perineum controls the perineum sphincters and perineal movement. And posterior to the central sulcus, this area is apart from sensory area of the body, which is also for lower limb and perineum, lower limb. So this area is for lower limbs and perineum, and this area is very important as it's called the paracentral lobule. In front of the paracentral lobule we have this gyrus, which is in front of the paracentral lobule we have this gyrus here, which is the medial frontal gyrus. It's part from the parietal association area. This is the medial frontal. Okay. What about this gyrus here, which extends between the callosal and cingulate? This is called gyrus cinguli, or the cingulate gyrus. Cingulate gyrus, it's part from the limbic loop or the limbic system of the brain. So the important gyri which are situated on the medial side of the brain is the lingual gyrus here, below the calcarine sulcus, and this triangular area, which is the cuneus. It's lying between the calcarine and the parietal occipital, and this quadrangular area here, which is the precuneus, just in front of the cuneus, between the parietal occipital fissure and the terminal part of the sulcus cinguli. And in front of the precuneus we will find the paracentral lobule, which is around the beginning of the central sulcus, and in front of the ascending limb of the sulcus cinguli, the rest of the parietal lobe is called medial frontal gyrus. Between the sulcus cinguli and callosal sulcus we have the cingulate gyrus of the brain. Another important area, which is the supplementary motor area, or the SMA. It is an extrapyramidal center which is situated on the medial frontal gyrus, just anterior to the paracentral lobule. So you can see it's lying here on the medial surface of the brain, on the medial frontal gyrus anterior to the paracentral lobule. This area is extending from the premotor area, which is lying on the lateral surface of the brain, area 6, the premotor area 6, also extend on the medial side of the brain as the SMA. So it has the function of postural control or postural stabilization of the body, and also coordinate both sides of the body. Also it controls sequences of movement, and it has no definite lesion. It's a part of the premotor area 6 on the lateral surface of the brain. Now we will cut between the two cerebral hemispheres exactly inside the center. So the first structure that I'm cutting now is a structure called Corpus Callosum. The Corpus Callosum is the largest commissural fiber that is joining between the two cerebral hemispheres, and then I'm cutting at the posterior end between the two cerebellar hemispheres, and exactly I'm passing in the middle of the brain stem. So if we separate these two structures here, you can see this is the medial surface of the brain, and the structures which are very obvious on the medial surface of the brain. So this structure here is called the corpus callosum. This is the largest commissural fibers that are joining, joining between the two parts of the cerebral hemisphere. So if we have a near look on the sulci and the gyri that are lies on the different areas of the cerebral hemisphere, this structure here is the corpus callosum. This is the corpus callosum of the brain. It begins near to the anterior end here as the rostrum of the corpus callosum. Then this part here is called geno of the corpus callosum, and this is the body of the corpus callosum. Lastly, this part here is the splenium of the corpus callosum. If you see, it's more obvious on the opposite side. This is the rostrum. This is the rostrum of the corpus callosum, and this is the geno. This is the body of the corpus callosum, and here is the splenium of the corpus callosum. Also, we have to identify this structure here. This structure is called the fornix. The fornix, as we mentioned in the theoretical session, is composed of this part, which is the anterior column, and this part is the body of the fornix, and here this is the crura of the fornix. The crura of the fornix, it passes in the depths of the brain until it appears on the inferior surface of the brain here as the hippocampus, because if we study the anatomy of the hippocampus, it lies in the parahippocampal gyrus on the inferior surface of the brain, and it gives efferent fibers. These efferent fibers are collected together to form the posterior column of the fornix, and then these crura or the posterior columns of the fornix are curved anterior to make the body of the fornix, then the anterior column of the fornix. These anterior columns are passing inside the brain until it reaches down here to the part on the interpeduncular fossa. It's called mammillary body. So this is the fornix, and this is the corpus callosum. What about this septum here, which joins between the fornix and the corpus callosum? This septum here is called septum lucidum, or septum that closes the cavity of the lateral ventricle. So if we open this septum here, on the other side, it's more obvious. This is the corpus callosum, and this is the fornix, and this is the septum. If we go beyond this septum here in the depths of the corpus callosum, you will find in the depths of the brain, this cavity here is called the lateral ventricle of the brain. So here, this is the lateral ventricle of the brain. If we reflect this part of the fornix here, it is clear that this cavity is the lateral ventricle inside the brain. So the first structure to be identified on the medial surface is the fornix, and then this here, this structure here, this is the first structure, which is the corpus callosum, and this structure here is called the fornix, and this is the septum lucidum, which closes the cavity of the lateral ventricle. Okay. Back to the sulci and the gyri on the medial surface. This is the frontal pole, and this is the occipital pole, and this is the cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum, and this is the occipital pole of the brain. Sulcus, which just above the corpus callosum here, this is called callosal sulcus. Callosal sulcus begins on the anterior part of the corpus callosum, and it runs just above the corpus callosum to reach the and it curves around the splenium of the corpus callosum. The callosal sulcus on the opposite side is this sulcus here, and it's lodged by this artery. This artery is obvious here. It is the anterior cerebral artery. As we mentioned, the anterior cerebral artery is one of the two terminal branches of the internal carotid artery, and it supplies most of the anterior or the medial surface of the brain. So this is the callosal sulcus, and this is the anterior cerebral artery in the callosal sulcus. Here, on top of the callosal sulcus, this gyrus lies between the callosal sulcus and this sulcus. This sulcus begins nearly to the anterior end of the brain, and also it curves backward to reach to this point, and it ends by curving upward here. This sulcus is called Cingulate sulcus, or the sulcus cingulate. So this is the cingulate sulcus, this is the cingulate sulcus, and this is the posterior end of the cingulate sulcus. Between the cingulate sulcus and the callosal sulcus, this gyrus is called the cingulate gyrus. Corpus callosum, fornix, septum lucidum, callosal sulcus, cingulate gyrus, cingulate sulcus. Here on the anterior end of the medial surface of the brain, this gyrus is called medial frontal gyrus. The gyrus which lies above, or which is situated above the cingulate sulcus, is called medial frontal gyrus. Remember that we have mentioned on the lateral surface of the brain a very important sulcus, which is the central sulcus. And we mentioned that the central sulcus begins on the 1 centimeter on the medial surface of the brain. This is the beginning of the central sulcus on the medial surface of the brain. You can see it clearly. This is the beginning of the central sulcus, and it curves on the whole lateral surface of the brain. We mentioned that there is a very important area which is situated around the central sulcus. This is called paracentral lobule. So the paracentral lobule here is situated around the beginning of the central sulcus, and it includes part of the precentral and postcentral gyri, which are situated on the lateral surface of the brain. As we mentioned, it contains the lower limb area for both motor and sensory functions, and also it contains the perineal function or the perineal structures, and sphincters that controls the perineal structures are situated here in the paracentral lobule. So this is the paracentral lobule. If you go backward here on the medial, on the most posterior end of the medial surface of the brain, you will identify this sulcus, which begins near to the splenium of the corpus callosum. This is the splenium of the corpus callosum, and this sulcus begins here. This sulcus is called Calcarine Sulcus. It begins here on the posterior end of the corpus callosum, and it curves backward on the occipital, or on the medial surface of the occipital lobe. This is called Calcarine Sulcus. And if you remember, we have mentioned the parieto-occipital fissure. The parieto-occipital fissure begins on the lateral surface of the brain, and it extends on the whole medial surface of the brain between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. This fissure is very obvious here on the medial side of the brain. This is the parieto-occipital fissure. So this is the parieto-occipital fissure, and this is the calcarine fissure or calcarine sulcus. Just below this calcarine sulcus, you should identify this gyrus here, which is called lingual gyrus. This is the lingual gyrus of the medial surface. Between the calcarine and the parieto-occipital, this triangular area here is called cuneus. This is the cuneus of the brain. Both are situated on the occipital lobe on the medial surface of the brain. Around the limb of the calcarine fissure here, in this area, we have a very important area, which is the primary visual area. So the primary visual area is situated around the limbs of the Calcarine Sulcus. Part of the visual area lies inside the cuneus and part lies inside the lingual gyrus below the calcarine fissure. Visual area controls the opposite visual field. And then this is the parieto-occipital fissure. Between the parieto-occipital fissure and the posterior part of or the terminal part of this cingulate sulcus, this area is called the precuneus. So we have the lingual gyrus, which is situated in the most posterior part, and then the cuneus, which is this triangular area, and then the precuneus here. In front of this precuneus, the paracentral lobule. So this is the paracentral lobule, and then the whole or the complete part of the medial side of the frontal lobe is called medial frontal gyrus. So if you arrange the sulci and the gyri from posterior to the anterior aspect of the medial surface, this is the lingual gyrus, this is the calcarine fissure, this is the cuneus, and this is the parieto-occipital fissure. This is the precuneus, this is the precuneus, and this is the paracentral lobule, and this is the medial frontal gyrus. This is the corpus callosum, and this is the callosal sulcus. This is the gyrus cingulate, and this is the sulcus cingulate. This is the fornix, and between the fornix and corpus callosum, as we mentioned, the septum lucidum, which closes the cavity of the lateral ventricle. Okay, what about this structure here? This structure is the thalamus of the brain. The thalamus is the largest sensory relay station of the brain. It receives all sensations and then redistribute the sensations to different parts of the brain. This is the thalamus, and on the opposite cerebral hemisphere here is the other thalamus. So this is the thalamus, and this is the other part of the thalamus or the other thalamus, and they are connected together by interthalamic adhesion, which lies in the middle here of the thalamus. This is the cavity of the lateral ventricle, and this is the thalamus. This is the cut edge of the midbrain. This is the midbrain, and this is the cut surface of the pons, and this is the cut surface of the medulla oblongata. As you can see, we have a canal. This canal, which is running inside the substance of the midbrain, dividing the midbrain into anterior part and posterior part. This canal is called Cerebral Aqueduct. This is the Cerebral Aqueduct. And here, this is the pons, and this is the medulla. Here we have a cavity between the pons, medulla, and cerebellum posterior. This cavity is called fourth ventricle, the fourth ventricle. And here, this is the medulla and continuous flow with the spinal cord. So the fourth ventricle is continuing below as the spinal canal, which is running inside the spinal cord. So you can identify the communications between the ventricles now. As we mentioned, this is the cavity of the lateral ventricle inside the brain. Between the two cerebral hemispheres, we have a cavity here. It's called the third ventricle. The third ventricle is the cavity which lies between the two cerebral hemispheres. So if we put these two cerebral hemispheres together and look from inside here, we have a small cavity. This cavity is slit-like and it lies here between the two thalami. So if you open the sagittal section, the thalamus will be on the, each thalamus will be on the lateral surface of the third ventricle. Here on the other side, this is the lateral surface of the third ventricle, which is represented by the thalamus and a structure anteroinferior to the thalamus here, which is hypothalamus. We have a communication between the lateral ventricle and the third ventricle, which is lying between the two cerebral hemispheres. This communication is just like here. It's just lying in front of the anterior end of the thalamus and behind the anterior column of the fornix. So this is the anterior column of the fornix. Between the anterior column of the fornix and the thalamus, this foramen is called interventricular foramen, which is the only communication between the cavity of the lateral ventricle inside the brain and this cavity here, which is the third ventricle. Then the third ventricle is connected to the cavity of the fourth ventricle through this canal, which is the Cerebral Aqueduct of Sylvius, inside the substance of the midbrain. So the Cerebral Aqueduct connects the cavity of the third ventricle to the cavity of the fourth ventricle, and the cavity of the fourth ventricle is connected directly to the central canal of the spinal cord downward. There is also connections between the fourth ventricle and subarachnoid space around the brain and the spinal cord by means of median foramen, which is foramen of Magendie, and two lateral foramens, which are foramens of Loschka. They will be mentioned and described in details in the section of the brain stem. So again, to summarize, sulci, gyri, and different structures that are situated on the lateral surface, on the medial surface of the brain. This is the cut edge of the brain or the cerebrum, and this is the cut edge of the cerebellum. And you can see here, this is the vermis of the cerebellum. Vermis is the connection between the two cerebellar hemispheres, which is this part, like a tree here. This is the vermis. You should identify first this structure, which is the corpus callosum, the largest commissural fiber of the brain, rostrum, genu, body, splenium of the corpus callosum. And then this part here is the fornix. Fornix is also from the commissural fibers of the brain. Between the fornix and corpus callosum is the septum lucidum, which closes the cavity of the lateral ventricle. On top of the corpus callosum, this sulcus is called callosal sulcus, and then another sulcus, this is called sulcus cingulate or sulcus cinguli, and another sulcus on the back here. This sulcus is called calcarine, and this is the parietal occipital fissure. And don't forget the central sulcus here between the motor and sensory area of lower limbs and sphincters of the perineum. The gyri, which are situated on the medial surface. This is gyrus cingulate, and this is the medial frontal gyrus. This is paracentral lobule. This area here is the precuneus, and this triangular area here is the cuneus, and this is the lingual gyrus of the brain. As we mentioned, this is the cerebellum, and this is the vermis, and this is the cut surface of the brain stem, midbrain, pons, medulla. This is the fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct. This is the thalamus, and it forms the lateral wall of the third ventricle. And don't forget the communications between the ventricles: interventricular foramen, cerebral aqueduct, and then the central canal of the spinal cord. We have another area here just lying posterior to just like anterior to the paracentral lobule. So if you identify this paracentral lobule, this area should be here in this part. It's called SMA, or supplementary motor area. If you move, or if you continue laterally from the SMA on the lateral surface, it will continue with the premotor area 6. So you can say that the SMA, or the supplementary motor area, which lies just in front of the paracentral lobule here, is the continuous or the continuation of the premotor area 6 on the opposite, or on the lateral surface of the brain. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the description of the brain. And if you have any inquiry, please refer to me, Dr. Maha El-Biltagi.